His statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much, President. Russia insisted that today's meeting be held as an open briefing. We want everybody to hear the truth. As a result of a terrorist attack, the head of the DPR, Mr. Zakharchenko, died on the 31st of August. His signature was on the Minsk agreements, and this situation has had a negative effect on the settlement. It is clear that this murder took place to destabilize the situation in the region. There is weighty evidence that suggests that the Ukrainians were involved in it, and this is fully consistent with Kiev's confessed logic of finding a solution by force to the domestic Ukrainian crisis. Our Western colleagues didn't give any views on this crime, and today they're even scared to give the floor to the representatives of the republics. But they could have informed the Council on the course of the investigation. On the 11th of November, elections should take place for the deputies of the People's Councils. This is because of the need to fill the vacuum in power after the murder of Mr. Zakharchenko. As far as the legitimacy of the elections goes, they have nothing to do with the Minsk package of measures, in which the matter at hand would be municipal elections. People simply need to live and to guarantee the viability of the region in conditions of blockade by Kiev of the region and the constant threat of use of force by the Ukrainian leadership. The situation in the southeast of Ukraine remains explosive. Kiev is not observing its agreements on ceasefire and has moved more than 15 kilometers into the grey zone. It is also refusing to fulfill its political commitments. It is trying to marginalize the mechanisms of the Minsk contact group and also to launch a second round of discussion on questions that have already been agreed. In this, it is being encouraged by Western partners. They have stated, for example, such as Kurt Volker, that the proclaimed Republic of Donbass doesn't have a place in the Minsk agreements and that they should disappear. And Petro Poroshenko also says that the Minsk format doesn't exist. What reaction do you expect from Donbass to such rhetoric? Today, we are witnesses of the latest round of hypocrisy, the total and inexcusable sabotage by Kiev of the Minsk agreements over the long term, factually from day one, has been completely ignored. Instead of recognizing this fact, in the discussion in the Security Council, instead we're discussing the forthcoming elections in November, which are a necessary measure in conditions of sabotage by Kiev of its political commitments, when people in the Donbass, the citizens of Ukraine, incidentally, have been simply thrown aside by the Ukrainian authorities. At the end of May this year, in the Security Council, we discussed the situation in Ukraine. At that time, in this room, we, in detail, point by point, went through the content of the Minsk agreements, which some of you have constantly encouraged Russia to fulfill. All of the points of the package of measures refer to Ukraine and to militias, not one of them to Russia. Not one of these points is being actually implemented by Ukraine. For 2 years already, Ukraine has refused to consolidate the Steinmeier formula, which the Ukrainian presidency signed up to. It outlines the way in which the different package of measures can be implemented, including how elections can be held. We constantly instead hear that Kiev is allegedly fulfilling these agreements. There are references to the Ukrainian parliament's adoption and extension of a law on the special status of Donbass. But have any of you actually read this law beyond its heading? We've repeatedly returned to the OSCE with a request to carry out a comprehensive analysis of the Minsk package of measures and the law, because it's absolutely obvious that it contradicts it. Besides Minsk, this document was developed without agreement with the DPR and the LPR, and it confers the special status only for a temporary time. It's also considered by other measures that have to come into force, which don't take into account the consistency of Minsk. The amendments to the constitution on decentralization have also been delayed, and the law on amnesty hasn't come into force. The Kiev authorities aren't fulfilling the Minsk agreements, and you are guilty of that, the European Union and the United States. The European Union and the United States constantly harp on that anti-Russian sanctions will be removed when the Minsk agreements will be fulfilled. But these agreements are not being fulfilled by the current Ukrainian authorities. So this position is basically an invitation to Ukraine to continue to sabotage the Minsk agreements, because it's Russia who'll pay for that. Kiev is happy to continue to do so. The English channel has been cut off. I do apologize. The Chinese channel's blocking the English. I do apologize. Kiev isn't doing anything to fulfill the political component within Minsk, including the provisions on elections, but protest when people in Donbass intend to fill the power vacuum left after the murder of Mr. Zakharchenko. Mr. President, our Western colleagues have a certain characteristic. They prefer not to hear what doesn't suit them or that they don't like. And this also refers to the package of measures on implementing the Minsk agreements. Once again, we firmly encourage you to read this document. It is useful for understanding. You have sponsored, in political and financial terms, the so-called revolution of dignity, and more precisely, a state uprising, and you don't like to hear this. You were the guarantors of the agreement signed by Yanukovych and the opposition, which the opposition quickly violated by seizing power, and you also don't like to hear that. You prefer instead to talk about Russian aggression and Russian military presence, which the head of the OSCE mission didn't note, Alexander Hook. He was disavowed there, and this part of the interview was simply removed. The problem is that you have simply issued an act of grace to the Ukrainian authorities. You close your eyes to everything that's happening there. You allow them to do and say everything that suits them. And the key authorities in Kiev do that. Look at the Ukrainian foreign policy, or more rightly, the lack of it. Everything that the mouthpieces of the Kiev authorities do on the international arena, all of the foreign policy agenda leads to one thing: anti-Russian invectives and philippics, and to anti-Russian initiatives. There's no more of that. Senator Cato, with his permanent encouragement to destroy Carthage, would turn in his grave. In fact, wouldn't even show up against the background of this. But you, unlike us, cannot hear the full Ukrainian political discourse in its original, and how, in a high-flown manner, they might call it a political. This is just one quote from a deputy of the Verkhovna Rada, Oleg Barna, on a leading Ukrainian television channel, and I quote, "Russians, that's not a people. It's a population without a history. They're bastards, a mix of Tatars and Mongols, a people who have always just stolen things from people," end of quote. That is a word-by-word quote, and I could give you a ton of similar ones. Why am I saying this? And also there's the fact that everybody in Ukraine understands Russian. More than around half the population speak Russian as a mother tongue, and in fact it's probably more than that. And to give you some indication, the Ukrainian authorities, including President Poroshenko, speak to themselves in Russian and only in the parliamentary chambers in Ukrainian. Not to mention the fact that a significant part of the population in Ukraine are actually Russians. Ukraine has adopted a discriminatory language law, which leaves virtually no place in the education system for the Russian language. Incidentally, the same is also true of Hungarian. You can ask the Hungarians, they'll tell you that. But the scale of the damage for Russian language is greater. There was a conclusion of the Venice Commission on the discriminatory nature of this law, but the Kiev authorities don't intend to change anything and instead keep making the same mistakes. And the question of language was one of the main reasons why the conflict in Donbass began in the first place. But this is not the only thing. You don't want to, and you cannot understand that living in a country for the population of Donbass, and not just Donbass, believe me, that living in a country where the mainstream includes politicians such as Barna, and they are in the mainstream there, isn't just a political or economic question, but it's also an existential issue. The inhabitants of Crimea breathed a sigh of relief when, in a referendum, voluntarily they agreed to become part of Russia. If they hadn't done this, then the situation there would be worse than it is in Donbass. You know that during the so-called resolution of dignity in Kiev, there was a hashtag that appeared, the mere children, in one word. What does it mean? Well, they'll just go. But we also have a saying that matches are not children's toys. Now, these children are wandering around Kiev holding rallies and using Nazi slogans as part of. And you also prefer not to notice that. You've let the genie out of the bottle. And it's not just that you don't want to, but you can't put it back. The great Russian poet Alexander Pushkin has a couple of lines. He says, "Oh, it takes little to deceive me. I cannot wait to be deceived. This is about you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Chairman.
Agradezco al distinguido.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.